It was a time of relief and thanksgiving. The Great War of 1914-18 was over. Now ordinary people looked to a prosperous future in they hoped a new world fit for heroes. Women, among others, were demanding the right to vote, and in Britain at least eventually got their wish in 1919. Not so in Bermuda, where the thought of women voting for members of the colonial parliament, or worse still, actually standing for parliament, filled most of the island's menfolk with dread. Bermuda still followed restrictive voting laws enacted at emancipation to keep newly freed blacks in check. Only men who owned property worth £60 could vote, and if they wanted to run for local councils or the House of Assembly, that figure was raised to £240. A champion for Bermuda's women rose up in the form of Sands-born Gladys Mizik, later Gladys Morrill. Before the war, she studied in England, where she joined the women's suffrage movement and became inspired by its leaders like Emmeline Pankhurst and Millicent Fawcett. She began campaigning in Bermuda and won influential support, or so she thought.
We are sure that the motion to introduce a bill giving the franchise to women on exactly the same terms as men will meet with the serious consideration it deserves. We have long been of the opinion that nothing but good can come of the bestowal of the right to vote upon qualified women in Bermuda. The Royal Gazette.
The House of Assembly seemed keen on the idea, but after a promised committee report failed to materialize after 3 years, it was apparent very little was going to happen. Gladys and her largely white, well-off supporters decided it was time for a new initiative, and in 1922 officially formed the Bermuda Women's Suffrage Society. They had no idea how long their fight was going to take.
It was seen by many in the community to be mainly a movement just for white women, because most of them own land, and the few black women in the community who own land were not easily identified with the movement, although one or two, like Alice Scott in particular, an outstanding Sands activist, did join the movement and tried to encourage the black community to participate. But in spite of that sort of isolationism, the movement itself saw itself as being the forerunner for change for all women, regardless of color. And so they continue to tackle in various ways the men of the country to educate them. Both black and white politicians were encouraged to come to their meetings. They sent them literature. They were encouraged to come to their various protest movements. And so after a period of time, they were able, a very long period of time, they were able to educate them to bring about some change.
Defeat followed defeat as the years of campaigning wore on. The suffragists tried to get official support from the British Parliament and failed. They brought in heavy-hitting supporters such as Emmeline Pankhurst and Viscountess Nancy Astor. Still, the Bermuda Assembly would not give in. Eventually, the suffragists knew they must take a tougher line.
Our society has embarked on a policy of attacking on two fronts. We have attacked on the Downing Street and Westminster front, and at present we are attacking on the home front. Gladys Morrill.
The Bermuda activists were not, however, like the earlier militant suffragettes of Emmeline Pankhurst's movement. There would be no chaining themselves to railings or throwing themselves under racehorses like their English counterparts.
Gladys Morrill and the others thought that if she didn't pay her taxes, she'd be hauled off to prison, and this would create a whole lot of publicity for the women's suffrage movement. So there she sat in her chair with her suffrage friends, waiting for the police to come and arrest her. But they never arrived. So the party kind of went on until the police never arrived. What was going on here? And the police in the end got wise to what was going on, because the police realized that Gladys Morrill wanted to be thrown into prison, and if she was thrown into prison, that would create all kinds of publicity for the women's movement, and the fact that Bermuda still didn't give its women the right to vote, or women still didn't have the right to vote in Bermuda. So she sat there and the police didn't arrive. However, when they did arrive, all they did was to confiscate some of her furniture, and they auctioned it off until they had the required amount of money that would pay her land taxes.
A cedar table was duly sold to pay the withheld taxes, albeit to a Morrill supporter, and similar auctions were held as the protest dragged on for years to come. One year, the suffragists played up to the press by holding a mock funeral before an auction, mourning the passing of justice. It was not until 1944 that an ambitious young politician, Henry Tucker, decided to champion the cause and helped steer a bill through the Assembly that finally gave limited voting rights to Bermudian women. Morrill and her supporters were overjoyed. Victory at last, 22 years after the start of their campaign, yet still many years after Bermudian women had begun helping themselves.
In the 1840s, women in St. George's organized a friendly society, one of the friendly societies. This was a women's organization. And the purpose of this women's branch of the friendly society was to help other women, women who may have lost their husbands at sea, or women whose husbands may have died and left them with a whole family to take care of. So these friendly societies, this particular women's organization, helped the women to help themselves. Now, the unique thing about this organization is that it was a black women's organization. And if you remember, emancipation took place in 1834. So here we are almost 6 years later, just about 6 years later, and women have organized themselves into a society to help other women.
The first battle for women's votes had been won, but it was to be many years before everyone in Bermuda was allowed to vote. There had been a few black representatives in the Assembly for many years, but most of the black population was still too poor to vote or to stand for office under island laws. As early as the turn of the century, individuals began canvassing for black rights. In 1902, trouble erupted when 250 Jamaicans were brought to Bermuda to work on an extension to the naval dockyard. From the start, the newcomers complained of substandard food and lodging, and claimed they often were not given work or even paid. Within a month, there was rioting.
The elite community tended to put them in what can basically be called substandard housing, and then turned around and blamed them for the housing that they were in. That was one of the major bones of contention that the West Indians had within their experience in Bermuda. The work problems related to the relationship with the Dockyard Extension Work Project managers, who persistently underpaid them in terms of their contractual arrangements. The contracts required them to be fully employed and fully paid. The Dockyard Extension Works managers oftentimes did not fully employ them, and as a result, they complained about the fact that they were not being paid and fully employed.
The workers' cause was taken up by an American AME minister working in Bermuda, the Reverend Charles Vinton Monk, who also published the crusading black newspaper New Era.
The New Era was published by an American minister, an AME minister, who was appointed to Bermuda in 1898 to take charge of Allen Temple Church and Mount Zion Church, the two AME churches in the west end of the island. And when Charles Vinton Monk, the Reverend Charles Vinton Monk, arrived here, he said he found so many things wrong with this little island of Bermuda that he was prepared to stand on one end and trip the other end up if he had to rectify things.
Monk lashed out in his newspaper against the contractor who employed the Jamaicans, C.H. Walker and Company of London. Monk paid the price for speaking up. He was instantly charged by the Bermuda Attorney General with criminal libel.
Monk was considered by the establishment here to have been a revolutionary, certainly in terms of the Bermudian context. Black people did not talk in terms of openly challenging the power structure here.
There followed a long and sensational trial, at the end of which Monk was jailed for 4 months and fined heavily. Eventually he moved back to the United States, but a beginning had been made for black people standing up for their rights. In 1925, Alfred Brownlow Place raised enough money to open the Bermuda Recorder under the editorship of another AME minister, the Reverend C.A. Stewart. The Recorder began serving the black community under the motto, "For the good of the public."
The policy of the Recorder is to educate the masses and by means of clean and wholesome news to keep them informed. David Tucker, editor, The Bermuda Recorder.
The newspaper was published for 50 years until closing its doors in 1975. After the First World War, the new tourism industry hit a major snag. The Quebec Steamship Company decided not to renew the island's regular service, and suddenly Bermuda had no way to export its goods or to bring in visitors. The island needed to attract another large shipping company, and it was decided the answer lay in giving America's ruling classes what they wanted: an exclusive enclave where the mega-rich could rub shoulders while they wintered in Bermuda.
Well, the Trade Development Board knew that the crucial element in this was to find a steamer company that would put good ships, luxurious ships, on the New York to Bermuda run. And in 1919, they found a British ship company, the Furnace Withy Line, through their office in New York, who were prepared to come to Bermuda and to supply it with the best kind of ships, fast ships, big ships, luxurious ships. But there was one quid pro quo that Furnace Withy wanted. They wanted to bait the hook in Bermuda. They knew that the ships would only be full of tourists if there was some magnet to draw them here. And that magnet was to be a very exclusive, high-end tourist destination, which would set the cachet in place for Bermuda tourism. If America's finest and richest people were seen there, then the other tourists would follow.
All eyes eventually fell on Tucker's Town, a quiet community overlooking Castle Harbour. The area had long been abandoned by most white families, but there remained a community of black farmers and fishermen who boasted 2 churches, a cricket pitch, a school, and a post office.
The problem was that you couldn't sell these building lots, you couldn't erect hotels, you couldn't plan golf courses if these black farmers were going to be in the midst of it. So it became imperative in the minds of the Furnace Withy Company and the Trade Development Board that these people had to be cleared. And since this was a very undemocratic society at the time, they used the power of the assembly to expropriate the land of these black farmers. Now, they did it fairly. They offered what was probably market value for the land. But the bottom line was that there was really no option. You could not stay if you didn't want to leave. And through the early 1920s, a commission was set up which uprooted, and I think that's a good word, uprooted the original citizens of Tuckerstown, offered them either cash or offered them new land down the way in Smith's Parish. Many of them snapped at the offer. They realized in a material sense this was the best thing to come their way, but some resisted. They did not want to leave their homeland.
Before long, the elegant homes of millionaires crowded Tucker's Town, surrounding the golf course of the exclusive Mid-Ocean Club. Tourist arrivals flourished in the next few years as other Americans followed the lead of their super-rich countrymen. Suddenly, Bermuda was the place to be, and not just in the wintertime. Furnace Withy provided the new liner Bermuda, followed by Monarch of Bermuda and Queen of Bermuda, floating palaces that confirmed Bermuda's place in the luxury vacation market. The race was also on to bring the first visitors by air. There had been a short-lived aviation company in Bermuda in 1919, but it would be many years before commercial airliners braved the long hop from the American mainland. Realizing the potential, the Bermuda government offered $10,000 to the first flight from America. No one claimed the prize, but in 1930, 3 American pilots managed to reach Hamilton Harbor in the seaplane Pilot Radio. Only then, after being forced to land on the waves, to beg a few gallons of fuel from some startled Bermudian fishermen. 7 years later, tourist air arrivals began when Imperial Airways and Pan American Airways launched regular services to the island aboard luxurious passenger seaplanes. Not only was the new mode of transport quick and easy, as opposed to a 3-day steam from New York, it also gave Bermudians a spectacular aerial view of the island few had seen before.
Around the reef swirl whirls of blue water in all the shades from turquoise, jade, and emerald to aquamarine, cobalt, and Prussian blue. So breathtaking is a sight, like every other man on board the flying boat, I am desperately aware that adequate description is beyond me. Ronald Williams.
And then came the railway. The privately financed Bermuda Railway began building a line from Somerset to St. George's through Hamilton. There were many problems and delays, but eventually the 22-mile line opened to great fanfare in 1931, 3 years late. At first, the railway was a huge success, tourists could load bicycles onto the train, ready to use once they reached their destination. Locals were soon referring cheerfully to their railway as Old Rattle and Shake, a name which stuck throughout the years. Unfortunately, the railway's glory days were soon to be over. Wartime use by the military left the line and rolling stock in very poor shape.
In a sense, the demise of the railway began as soon as it opened. Well, although if you look at the passenger figures for the 1930s, there's a marked uprise in passengers, and so statistically it looks as if the railway was doing well, but in actual fact it wasn't. And certainly by the time of 1939 rather, with the dawn of the Second World War, we get an influx of troops in particular into this country, as has happened because of our strategic location. This train network, of course, had been designed, the cabins, the compartments had been designed with nice wicker seats. They'd been designed for an era of young ladies getting on with their children, with little dainty bags to put in the roof racks, to sit down on nice seats with little parasols. The train had been designed for that purpose. It had not been designed for whatever, the 45th Battalion getting on board with 120-pound packs to be stuffed up in the roof rack, hobnail boots, rifle butts to be smashed onto the floor. So the wear and tear on the railway, particularly during the war period, 1939 onwards, when there was this incredible increase in passengers, the wear and tear was extraordinary. And this wear and tear, of course, coincided with, we may not like to admit it, but of course this is a time when the men did all of the work on the railway, or by and large did a lot of it.
Worse, engineers discovered shoddy workmanship during construction meant the railway now needed extensive and expensive repairs.
They said that the Bermuda Railway was really in a deterioration and dangerous state. They stated categorically that 17 out of the 33 bridges or trestles needed to be instantly replaced because they were dangerous. And of course the Bermuda Railway Company didn't have money to do any of it anyway.
Eventually the Bermuda government stepped in and bought the railway for a mere $115,000. They operated the line at a loss for a short while, before finally selling the whole operation to British Guiana. After just 17 years in operation, Old Rattle and Shake was no more. One great contribution by the railway was helping build massive American bases during the Second World War. The 99-year deal for the bases was struck in 1940, 1 year into the Second World War, between British leader Winston Churchill and American President Franklin Roosevelt. The war against Nazi Germany was going badly, and Britain urgently needed support from the Americans, at that time still neutral. The Americans, in turn, feared a Nazi takeover of Bermuda would have terrible consequences to their own security.
If Bermuda fell into hostile hands, it would be a matter of less than 3 hours for hostile bombers to reach our shores. Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Although the United States was a friend, there were fears, even an expectation, that Bermuda would either be given to or annexed by the Americans. In fact, secret negotiations had been going on since before the outbreak of war.
History books often record that the Bermuda bases were acquired in exchange for giving 50 destroyers to the United Kingdom. And this is not entirely the case. What in fact happened was that the lease was signed for the Bermuda, or the right to build a base in Bermuda, 2 days before war was declared in Europe between Germany and England. And this was clearly because at the highest levels, the strategic importance of Bermuda was appreciated. What generally eventually happened was that rather than containing the United States, Bermuda made it possible for the United States to extend its coast, if you will, out to Bermuda, that is to say 700 miles eastward into the sea, plus the air cover from the planes based at Bermuda.
The Americans expected to install 4,500 troops. They wanted to build a huge new air base over most of Warwick Parish and some of Southampton, effectively cutting Bermuda in two. Bermudians were appalled, but also felt duty-bound to oblige. Their fears were eased when the British authorities proposed a different site for the American airfield, on the islands of Castle Harbour, and the Americans quickly agreed. Churchill sent a message to the House of Assembly.
I have today signed the documents implementing the agreement of September last for leasing to the United States of bases in Bermuda and elsewhere. and I wish to express to you my strong conviction that these bases are important pillars to the bridge connecting the two great English-speaking democracies. You have cause to be proud that it has fallen to your lot to make this important contribution to our world. Winston Churchill.
Work began on a naval base in the Great Sound on Morgan's and Tucker's Islands, followed by construction of the East End airfield. The endeavour was colossal. Squadrons of heavy machinery began bulldozing the islands of Castle Harbour and dredging 35 million square yards of rock and coral to make landfill. The formerly peaceful backwater became a screeching, thundering mass of dust and industry. American engineers had obliterated Cooper's Island, Longbird Island, a large portion of St. David's, and created more than 750 acres of new land. A glistening new airstrip called Kindley Field stretched across the East End, and thousands of Americans moved in, permanently, it seemed to many. Once the dust settled, Bermudians began to feel better about the arrangement. Thousands of Americans meant thousands of dollars waiting to be spent, and there was a large void to be filled with the departure of the tourist trade. Islanders and Americans soon got along famously, especially once the US entered the war in 1942. While the Americans poured in, almost 200 Bermudians headed out to fight alongside Allied forces around the world. Men from the Bermuda Militia Infantry joined the Caribbean Regiment, while contingents from the White Bermuda Volunteer Rifle Corps and Bermuda Volunteer Engineers were attached to the Lincolnshire Regiment. In all, 35 Bermudians gave their lives overseas during the war. At home, the Bermuda Militia Artillery and the Bermuda Volunteer Engineers manned the 6-inch guns and searchlights of St. David's Battery.
One of the most important and interesting of the later forts at St. David's Battery. St. David's Battery is one of the few forts that was built by Bermudian laborers and also manned by Bermudians. The Bermuda Militia Artillery manned the guns, the 6-inch guns, and the Bermuda Volunteer Engineers manned the searchlights. And some very interesting stories about things that happened at the battery while these Bermudians were serving there. One that particularly comes to mind is the man who operated the searchlight needed to be on station immediately if there was an alarm. And so if the alarm was sounded, no matter what you happened to have on at the time, you had to rush to the searchlight. And you often had men at the searchlight in just a pair of shorts and boots. And one of the problems with that is that as soon as the searchlight was turned on, every bug within 3 miles of the searchlight homed in on this light and, of course, ended up on the arms and chest of the men.
More huge guns were brought to the island by both Americans and British and installed in a flurry of work. Bermudian riflemen and militiamen were called on to guard installations like the Atlantic Cable Hut in Tucker's Town, the docks and telephone and electricity stations.
So I was sent to Wreck Hill with 3 men and a Lewis gun to take care of all that section of Wreck Hill. I don't know how we were going to do it, but one funny thing that I was given instructions that I had 3 men and myself, and I was supposed to double guard at night. So I said, I don't know how I'm going to do that with 3 men, but anyhow, I'll do my best.
Interned enemies also came under their guard. At first, a handful of German and Austrian nationals were interned at Huntley Towers in Paget. Over the course of the war, a number of prisoners of war were taken, usually from captured shipping, and these Germans, Italians, Poles and Finns were held at Fort Cunningham on Paget Island. Meanwhile, Bermuda rapidly became a hive of wartime activity. The Royal Navy's West Atlantic Squadron operated out of Dockyard, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse with Nazi pocket battleships. The Americans successfully flew missions from the island to search and destroy other German U-boats. There was a small Allied submarine depot at Ordnance Island in St. George's, and up to 1,000 censors were brought in to sift through mountains of transatlantic mail. The censors were checking for any secrets being passed to Germany, and often intercepted valuables such as diamonds on their way to swell Nazi coffers. Their work infuriated Nazi Germany.
This home of pirates, buccaneers and thieves now lives up to its vile reputation by pirating mail. Berlin Radio.
At last, Allied forces overwhelmed the Nazis and Germany finally went down to defeat in 1945. The war was over, but in Bermuda the Americans stayed on. In time, their airbase becoming a civilian airport that would bring hundreds of thousands of tourists to the island. Bermuda had played its part in gaining victory, but the peaceful, sleepy island of yesteryear was never to be seen again. Bermuda neither looked nor thought the way it had just 6 years earlier. War thrust it into the mechanized industrial age. Now it was time for Bermuda to join the world at large.